January 14, 1944. 28,000 feet above the gray haze of northwestern Germany, sunlight strikes the canopy of a P-47 Thunderbolt, a metallic beast as large as a small truck, trembling at the edge of its ceiling. Below, a swarm of black dots rises, Bf-109s climbing to intercept the bombers. The radio crackles with clipped American voices. "Bandits! 2 o'clock high!" The pilot shoves the nose down. Instantly, the altimeter spins. The sound changes, from a roar to a scream. Air howls past the canopy, and the pressure pins him deep into his seat. The heavy radial engine becomes a blazing comet, and the Thunderbolt, all 8 tons of steel and fire, dives like a meteor tearing through the winter sky. German fighters try to follow, but their airframes shudder. Some peel away, others risk the fall and vanish into vapor. For the men who flew her, this was more than speed. It was survival. And for the Allies, those meteoric dives would soon rewrite the balance of power in the skies over Europe. From this single moment begins the story of how the P-47 Thunderbolt changed the air war forever. By early 1943, the air war over Europe had entered its most brutal phase. The Allied bomber streams of the 8th Air Force, massive box formations of B-17s and B-24s, were pushing deeper into German airspace with one clear goal: break the Reich's industrial spine. But the further they flew, the more they bled. Luftwaffe fighters attacked in disciplined waves, shredding bomber groups before they could reach their targets. Escort fighters simply could not go the distance. It was in this desperate gap that the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt arrived, a machine that seemed, at first glance, too heavy, too large, and too ungainly for the high-speed duels over Europe. Yet within months, its roar would echo across the continent, and its dive would become legend. Soft tone shift. If the film feels alive to you, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which country or city you're watching from. This story belongs to every sky that ever trembled under a Thunderbolt's shadow. The Thunderbolt began as a problem child. Designed around the enormous Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine, it needed a complex turbo supercharger system routed through ducts running along the fuselage to the tail. The result was a fighter that weighed nearly twice as much as the Spitfire or Bf-109. Ground crews joked that it was built by a blacksmith, and even its pilots doubted it at first. But beneath that bulk lay genius engineering, unmatched strength, a cockpit that could absorb punishment, and an engine that rarely quit. Its baptism came in the spring of 1943. The 4th and 56th Fighter Groups took the first P-47s across the Channel, escorting bombers toward Rouen and Saint-Nazaire. The pilots quickly learned that climbing and turning against German fighters was suicide. But diving? That was another story. When the throttle pushed forward and the prop bit into thin air, the Thunderbolt's mass became its weapon. It could drop like a stone, gaining more than 600 miles per hour in seconds. Speed so extreme that instruments blurred and wings shuddered. Many pilots blacked out momentarily, pinned by G-forces, trusting the machine to hold together until thinner air allowed them to pull out. At first, no one understood why some Thunderbolts refused to respond in those dives. Pilots described the stick locking solid, the nose refusing to rise, and the ground rushing up like a tidal wave. This was compressibility, the threshold where air itself became unmanageable as the aircraft neared the speed of sound. Engineers scrambled to study the phenomenon, gathering reports from men who survived those terrifying descents. It was here that the P-47's toughness saved lives. Its thick wings and overbuilt frame allowed recovery where lighter fighters might have disintegrated. Recovery procedures evolved: throttle back, neutralize controls, and wait until denser air restored authority. What had been a flaw became a tactical edge, a controlled fall the enemy could not follow. By mid-1943, Thunderbolt squadrons were learning to exploit that very strength. They began attacking from above, diving through enemy formations with blistering speed, firing short bursts from 8 heavy Browning 50 caliber guns, and then plunging away before German fighters could react. It was called boom and zoom, and it turned the P-47's weight into momentum. German pilots soon realized what they were up against. One FW-190 ace reportedly remarked, "The Thunderbolt dives like a devil and climbs like a stone." But that first half of the sentence was all the Americans needed. The numbers began to speak. During late summer 1943, P-47 units claimed hundreds of victories while suffering far fewer losses than expected. The machine that had been mocked as overweight now dominated the vertical battlefield. Still, the problem of range haunted Allied planners. With internal fuel alone, Thunderbolts could barely reach the German border before turning home, leaving bombers exposed over the heart of the Reich. But their combat effectiveness was undeniable. Pilots praised the aircraft's ability to absorb damage. Bullet holes stitched across wings, oil pressure dropping, yet the big radial engine bringing them home. Each sortie revealed a deeper truth. This was not a fragile duelist. It was an airborne battering ram built for survival. As 1943 drew toward its close, the lessons learned in blood began to reshape the air campaign. Dive tactics, energy management, and high-altitude interception all centered around the Thunderbolt's defining strength. Its ability to fall faster than anything in the sky and live to climb again. Those dives were not born of recklessness. They were born of physics and of men who discovered that victory sometimes meant trusting gravity more than wings. And those discoveries set the stage for what came next. A transformation of strategy, range, and doctrine that would carry into 1944, when Thunderbolts began striking deeper than ever before. By the dawn of 1944, the 8th Air Force faced a cruel paradox. The P-47 Thunderbolt had become a lethal hunter within its limited reach, yet beyond that invisible line, somewhere over central Germany, the bombers still flew alone. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions of 1943 had proven it in fire. Out of 376 bombers dispatched, 60 never returned. Crews called it the corridor of death. The lesson was clear. Without long-range escort, the daylight offensive could not survive, but the men flying Thunderbolts refused to stand aside. The aircraft's designers at Republic Aviation worked feverishly to stretch its range. External drop tanks began appearing under the wings, cylinders of aluminum and rivets that dripped fuel but bought time. First 75-gallon belly tanks, then 108-gallon paper tanks, and finally the 150-gallon steel versions. With each increment, the Thunderbolt pushed deeper into Germany. At the same time, tactics evolved. Pilots learned to use altitude as both shield and sword. They climbed to the stratosphere, waiting until German interceptors broke formation to attack the bombers, then fell upon them like predators from the clouds. These dives were not panic reactions. They were rehearsed slashes of controlled violence. A few seconds of gunfire, then pull back up, climb, reset, repeat. Each mission refined the method. The 56th Fighter Group, led by Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, became the model of this new warfare. Zemke's men called themselves the Wolfpack, and their reputation spread quickly across Allied bases in England. Zemke understood something essential. The Thunderbolt was not a knife fighter, it was a hammer. Instead of swirling and turning dogfights, he taught his pilots to attack from advantage, hit fast, and disengage before losing energy. The dive, therefore, became doctrine. But these dives were not without terror. As the aircraft hurtled past 450 miles per hour, control surfaces stiffened and visibility blurred. Veteran pilots like Francis Gaby Gabreski described the sensation. You were along for the ride, and you prayed the machine wanted to live as much as you did. Even so, the statistics told a story of confidence, a rising kill ratio that no other Allied fighter in the European theater could match during that period. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe began to falter under the weight of attrition. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and constant Allied pressure meant that by early 1944, German squadrons were increasingly reactive. They learned to fear the sudden silver streaks that appeared out of the sun, dove through their ranks, and vanished toward the horizon at impossible speed. Engineers back in the United States continued refining the P-47 systems. Later variants, the D-25 and beyond, featured paddle blade propellers to improve climb and acceleration, bubble canopies for 360-degree vision, and strengthened dive brakes to handle extreme descent speeds. Each change turned hard-earned battlefield lessons into tangible improvements. But what truly set the Thunderbolt apart was not technology alone. It was the men who adapted their tactics around its physics. The P-51 Mustang would later take the mantle of long-range escort, but in the crucial months before its full deployment, it was the Thunderbolt that held the line, proving that the Luftwaffe could be challenged, even beaten, at its own game. In those months, the culture of air combat shifted. Pilots spoke less about dogfighting and more about energy fighting. They plotted engagements like chess moves, altitude as reserve, dive as attack, climb as retreat. Every mission debrief was a classroom in aerodynamics and survival. This strategic transformation mirrored a larger truth. The Allied war machine was learning faster than the Axis could replace what it lost. Every crash-recovered P-47, every field modification, every debrief turned into a manual page for the next generation of pilots. When 1944's spring arrived, the Thunderbolt was ready for its next role. Beyond the duels in the thin air, new missions awaited. Low-level sweeps, railway strikes, convoy interdictions, and pre-invasion bombardments. The same aircraft that once ruled the stratosphere would soon be diving at ground targets with terrifying precision. The legend of the Meteor dive would move from the clouds to the earth, reshaping both air combat and ground warfare in a single breath. By the time Allied forces prepared for D-Day, the roar of P-47 engines over northern France had become a sound the Wehrmacht could identify instantly and dread instinctively. And so, as Europe braced for invasion, the Thunderbolt evolved again, from defender to avenger, from escort to executioner. That transformation is best understood through the men who flew it, the enemies who feared it, and the machines that could not match its descent. Those perspectives, human, tactical, technological, and moral, define the next chapter. The human angle to understand why Thunderbolts dived like meteors. One must first understand the men inside them. The cockpit of a P-47 at full power was a world of noise, vibration, and heat. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 thundered so loud it felt like a heartbeat in metal. Instruments jittered. The canopy trembled with altitude changes. The smell of oil and cordite lingered in the oxygen mask. When the dive began, time itself changed. Pilots reported tunnel vision, the blood draining from their faces as G-forces spiked. Their gloved hands gripped the stick with the pressure of survival. The altimeter spun like a clock gone mad. Below, the earth surged up in silence until, at the last moment, the world roared back. Wind, impact, recoil, and the climb to safety. Many called it riding the thunder. For others it was pure fear masked by training. Yet each man knew the dive was his edge. Hub Zemke reminded his pilots, "Speed is life." They took that literally. The faster the descent, the greater the chance of living through it. In the ready rooms of Boxted, King's Cliff, and Halesworth, young Americans learned to trust gravity more than instinct. They studied reports of those who didn't pull out in time. Friends who vanished in smoke spirals across the fields of occupied France. Yet the next morning they strapped in again. Because the Thunderbolt, for all its terror, gave them something rare in war. A machine that could take punishment and bring them home. The tactical angle, the P-47's entire strategy revolved around altitude and energy. The Luftwaffe's Bf-109s and Fw-190s could outturn almost anything. But they could not outdive a Thunderbolt. Zemke's doctrine was simple. Never fight on the enemy's terms. Thunderbolt pilots climbed to 25,000, 30,000 feet, far above the bomber streams. When German formations rose to attack, they plunged from the sun in sudden, near-vertical strikes. 8 50-caliber guns fired less than 3 seconds, each shell laced with tracer fire bright enough to light the cockpit glass. Then, without hesitation, they pulled back and disappeared into the haze. This boom and zoom style broke the rhythm of German attacks. Luftwaffe leaders complained that the American heavy fighter strikes like a hammer from above and vanishes before we can respond. Each dive exploited physics. The P-47's weight converted altitude into kinetic force. In the thin air of high Europe, that momentum made it untouchable. Once the Germans followed into a dive, they faced a death choice: continue past safe speed and risk structural failure, or break off and lose contact. The Thunderbolt's heavy frame gave Allied airmen an unusual freedom: to engage when they wanted, and to escape when they needed. Combat reports describe attacks ending with both sides vanishing into cloud, but the P-47s returning intact while their opponents never reappeared. Energy, not agility, defined the future of air combat, and it was the P-47 that taught the Allies that lesson first. The technological angle: every great weapon of war carries a paradox, and the Thunderbolt's was this. Its size, often mocked, was its greatest strength. The aircraft's radial engine, weighing more than a car, sat within a reinforced firewall. The wings were thick, the spars overbuilt. The fuel lines were protected by self-sealing tanks. Engineers at Republic had not designed it for elegance. They had built a flying fortress around a single seat. That design made it the ideal platform for high-speed dives. The thick elliptical wings delayed the onset of compressibility. The robust frame withstood loads that would have torn lighter fighters apart. Test pilots pushed it beyond 550 mph in near-vertical drops, speeds unthinkable for a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt. The turbo-supercharger system, routing exhaust gases through long ducts to a turbine in the tail, kept engine performance steady even at 30,000 feet. It made the Thunderbolt one of the few Allied fighters capable of maintaining full power in the thin air of the upper atmosphere. Its 8 Browning machine guns, synchronized in perfect harmony, could unleash nearly 13 pounds of lead per second, enough to shred a bomber or set a locomotive ablaze. Yet the true marvel wasn't the hardware itself. It was how those features converged. Every bolt, duct, and plate turned the Thunderbolt into a machine built for descent, a predator that attacked not with finesse, but with gravity. The enemy angle from the other side of the sky, the Thunderbolt looked almost supernatural. German pilots used to dueling with nimble Spitfires were stunned by this enormous silver brute that refused to break apart no matter how steeply it dived. Reports from Luftwaffe units described it as an armored monster and the falling thunder. Their early counter-tactics failed. Attempts to lure Thunderbolts into turning fights often ended in frustration. The Americans simply climbed away. Head-on attacks against bomber formations became deadly traps once the P-47s began descending from above. By late 1943, German radio intercepts even contained warnings. Do not pursue Thunderbolts in dive. Fatal speed. Some Luftwaffe aces tried anyway. Many never returned. One Bf-109G pilot recorded in his diary, "We dove after the Yabos near Aachen. My aircraft began to tremble. The speed indicator passed 850 km/h. I pulled, but the stick would not move. I released pressure and prayed. The Thunderbolt pulled up far below, climbing again. I was lucky to live." These accounts spread fear faster than any statistic. In a war fought as much in psychology as in firepower, fear mattered. Pilots began avoiding certain altitudes, giving Allied bombers vital breathing space. The Thunderbolt had achieved something no amount of propaganda could. It convinced the enemy that pursuit meant death. By the start of 1944, those lessons crystallized into doctrine. Each dive, each maneuver, each fear in the mind of the Luftwaffe pilot built toward a turning point soon to come, when speed itself would rewrite the meaning of dominance in the European skies. 5. The leadership and doctrine. Angle leadership in war often means recognizing what a machine wants to do and shaping men to use it that way. Few leaders understood this better than Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke. Zemke, a Montana-born pilot with a calm voice and sharp intuition, studied every report coming from his squadrons. He noticed patterns. Pilots who fought defensively died, but those who attacked from above survived. He rewrote the rulebook of aerial engagement, turning the Thunderbolt's weight and speed into doctrine. He called it the Zemke fan. At the start of an intercept, Thunderbolts would spread wide in a shallow arc ahead of the bombers, forming a protective fan at high altitude. When the Luftwaffe appeared, the groups collapsed inward, diving at angles that trapped enemy formations in crossfire. It was simple, brutal, and devastating. Zemke didn't demand recklessness. He demanded control. His debriefs were lessons in physics as much as courage. Conserve energy. Dive only from advantage. Never turn with the enemy. And if you feel fear in the descent, trust the airplane. Under his command, the 56th Fighter Group became the top-scoring American unit in the European theater, with hundreds of aerial victories. His pilots, men like Robert Johnson, David Schilling, and Francis Gaby Gabreski, became household names across Allied airfields. Zemke's legacy went beyond numbers. He had proven that tactical discipline, not just heroism, could break the back of a superior enemy force. In the process, the Thunderbolt stopped being just a fighter plane. It became a flying philosophy. Speed is protection, altitude is freedom, discipline is victory. That philosophy would echo through every fighter command that followed, shaping not just World War II, but the jet age to come. The moral and operational angle. This Thunderbolt's story is also a study in transformation, from high-altitude interceptor to low-altitude executioner. By mid-1944, with air superiority tipping toward the Allies, the P-47's mission changed. New Mustangs took over deep escort duties, and the Thunderbolt turned its strength to the ground war. What had once been a meteor in the sky became a hammer on the earth. Armed with bombs and rockets, Thunderbolts descended upon rail lines, convoys, and armor columns with terrifying precision. The same dive that had once outpaced Messerschmitts now targeted trains, bridges, and tank battalions. German soldiers nicknamed it Jabo, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber. But in their diaries, another word appeared more often: Todesengel, angel of death. Reports from the Falaise pocket tell of Thunderbolts striking every road out, leaving smoking wrecks for miles. French farmers later described hundreds of vehicles burning in lines like broken toy cars. For Allied ground troops pushing inland, the roar of P-47s overhead was the sound of survival. But for the pilots, the moral line grew thinner. They could see what they hit now, not distant specks, but men running for cover. One veteran wrote, "The dive feels the same, the pullout feels the same, but the silence after is heavier." These missions blurred the boundary between air combat and ground warfare. They also exposed the human heart of industrialized war: courage, fatigue, guilt, and the grim pride of effectiveness. From a purely operational standpoint, the Thunderbolt's ground attack campaign was devastating. In the months after D-Day, P-47s destroyed over 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 vehicles, and thousands of artillery positions. Entire panzer divisions stalled not from defeat in battle, but from starvation of fuel and movement. The skies over Europe had become Allied territory, and the Thunderbolt's shadow stretched across them all. As summer 1944 deepened into invasion season, every dive, every smoke trail, and every broken convoy pointed toward a single truth: the war in the air had changed forever. And the moment that change became irreversible would come soon after, when the Thunderbolt's greatest test arrived in the skies above France and Germany, where speed, precision, and courage would converge in one final turning point. February the 20th, 1944. The sky over Germany was clear, pale and filled with contrails, long white scars stretching from horizon to horizon. It was the beginning of Big Week, Operation Argument, a massive Allied offensive meant to crush the Luftwaffe once and for all. And for the first time, the P-47 Thunderbolt would lead the charge not as an escort alone, but as a hunter. For months, Allied planners had studied German industry, the aircraft factories at Leipzig, Regensburg, Gotha, and Schweinfurt. The goal was simple: destroy the Luftwaffe on the ground and in the air simultaneously. But that meant deep strikes, hundreds of miles inside enemy territory, right into the heart of flak and fighter defenses. It was the kind of mission only the bravest would fly, and only the toughest aircraft could survive. At dawn, hundreds of B-17s and B-24s lifted from English airfields, their engines shaking the ground. Minutes later, formations of Thunderbolts rose behind them, silver giants glinting against the rising sun. Each pilot knew what waited ahead. Waves of German fighters desperate to stop the bombers before they reached the factories. By 10 a.m., the first contacts appeared near Brunswick. Dozens of FW-190s dived from above, followed by sleek Bf-109Gs, guns blazing. The air filled with tracer fire. Amid that chaos, Zemke's Wolfpack, flying high cover, unleashed the full doctrine of the Thunderbolt. They attacked from altitude, steep, screaming dives through the enemy swarms, each pass lasting only seconds but leaving burning wrecks in their wake. The speed was blinding. Some P-47s hit 520 mph in descent, the air compressing around them so tightly that ailerons locked and instruments froze. But the pilots trusted the machine. They had trained for this. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, one of Zemke's top aces, later described it. At full dive, you felt the controls harden. Your hands go numb, your legs crushed by Gs, but you knew the 190s couldn't follow. You'd see them fall away in your mirror, and that was when you leveled out, still alive. By noon, the Thunderbolts had torn open the German formations. The Luftwaffe tried to regroup, but coordination faltered. American formations pressed deeper, unrelenting. By sunset, 355 German aircraft had been destroyed or damaged, the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe's defensive capability. But Big Week wasn't a single day. It was 5 days of hell. Between February 20th and 25, 1944, Thunderbolt squadrons flew hundreds of sorties, attacking not only interceptors but also airfields, hangars, and rail yards. They hunted planes even as they landed or taxied, diving low through smoke and debris. One pilot recalled flying so low that the heat from burning hangars melted the paint on his wings. It was during these missions that the Thunderbolt's dive, once a tactic of escape, became a tactic of domination. Pilots didn't fear compressibility anymore. They used it as a weapon. The sound barrier, still mysterious in 1944, became their ally. German reports from the period record disbelief. American fighters approach from impossible angles, too fast for gunfire. Radar operators tracking the dives thought they were recording falling bombs. The psychological effect was immense. Luftwaffe ground crews began to panic at the sight of high contrails, knowing what followed. For bomber crews, morale soared. They watched, for the first time, as German interceptors broke apart under Thunderbolt attacks. By the end of Big Week, the Luftwaffe had lost nearly 1/3 of its operational fighters. Hundreds of trained pilots were dead, wounded, or missing. The Reich's air defense was bleeding faster than it could recover. Yet the cost to the Americans was also heavy. Dozens of Thunderbolts didn't return. Some vanished in cloud banks. Others broke apart in uncontrolled dives. But their sacrifice had forced open the gates of the German sky. From this moment onward, the Allies owned the air over Europe. Still, this was not the end of the Thunderbolt story, merely its transformation. For while Big Week crippled the Luftwaffe's ability to defend, the next phase of the war demanded something even more brutal, turning that dominance into destruction on the ground. In the months that followed, as preparations for D-Day gathered momentum, the P-47 would leave contrails behind and descend to treetop level, trading duels for devastation, and sky supremacy for tactical annihilation. The war's center of gravity was shifting downward, from clouds to earth, from pursuit to punishment. And in that new world, the Thunderbolt's legendary dive would find its most devastating purpose, June 6, 1944, D-Day. Dawn broke gray over the English Channel, as thousands of Allied ships pushed toward Normandy. Behind them, invisible at first, came a second invasion, one that fell from the sky in fire and steel. By sunrise, hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts were already airborne from airfields across southern England. They weren't there to escort bombers this time. Their mission was to dive, again and again, into the storm of war below. For the first time in the European campaign, the Thunderbolt's legendary descent was being used not against fighters, but against the German army itself. As the beaches of Omaha, Utah, Juneau, and Gold erupted in chaos, the radio channels filled with urgent coordinates. Convoys, gun positions, and fortified crossroads were all marked for immediate strike. The same aircraft that had once raced through 30,000-foot dogfights now skimmed treetops, diving through smoke, tracing the trenches and hedgerows of Normandy like a hunter smelling blood. Every dive felt personal. Pilots could see the chaos below, the sand churned by shell fire, men crawling between obstacles, tanks burning like torches. Yet above that horror, discipline ruled. Dive, release, pull, climb, repeat. The Thunderbolt's armor and rugged design made it perfect for this new war. Where lighter fighters would have shredded under ground fire, the P-47 could take hits and return home riddled with holes. Crews joked that a Thunderbolt didn't crash. It just landed somewhere else. From June through August 1944, the Allies unleashed the full fury of the Jabot. Thunderbolts struck bridges over the Seine, railway yards at Caen, fuel convoys on the Falaise roads, and every moving column west of Paris. Each attack began the same way, a black dot high above, growing larger, brighter, faster, until the sky itself seemed to fall. One German infantryman later wrote, "They came down like stars at night. You'd hear the whistle and think it was the end of the world." There was no escape from the diving ones. For Allied soldiers on the ground, that sound became something else entirely. Salvation. The roar meant friendly fighters were overhead, clearing paths, silencing artillery, breaking counterattacks before they began. The airfields of northern France became non-stop launch pads. Pilots flew 5, sometimes 6 missions a day. Maintenance crews worked with wrenches still hot from engine heat. Fuel trucks rolled like lifelines. Every few hours, the metallic scream of a dive echoed across the hedgerows, the pulse of a continent being reclaimed. And then came the Falaise pocket, August 1944. As German forces tried to retreat from Normandy, the roads between Argentan and Chambois turned into death corridors. Thunderbolts circled above like hawks. Every movement below, a tank, a truck, even a horse cart, became a target. The P-47s attacked in waves, rockets, and bombs, carving burning paths through the enemy column. Photographs from reconnaissance aircraft show smoke stretching for miles, roads so jammed with wreckage that escape became impossible. In those days, even hardened Luftwaffe veterans admitted defeat. The air that had once belonged to them was now owned by the Allied fighter bombers, by machines that could appear from nowhere, dive with impossible speed, and vanish into the clouds before a gun could turn. Each success came at a cost. Pilots faced heavy flak, small arms fire, and exhaustion. Some never returned. Many came back with engines shredded or control surfaces half destroyed. But every return flight, no matter how damaged, proved the Thunderbolt's resilience. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a survivor. By September, the German High Command had lost the ability to move by day. Armored divisions hid under trees, convoys drove at night, and anti-aircraft crews fired blindly at the sky. The Wehrmacht's tactical paralysis had begun. It was in those same weeks that General Eisenhower made his famous observation: "The P-47 has become one of the decisive factors in breaking the enemy's power of resistance." In that simple sentence lay the essence of the Thunderbolts' journey, from an underestimated brute to the instrument that changed the rhythm of a continent-wide war. The Thunderbolt's dive, once a desperate escape maneuver, had become the Allies' most devastating weapon of precision. What had begun as a battle for survival above Germany had evolved into an unrelenting campaign that left no safe ground for the enemy below. By late 1944, Even as newer aircraft like the P-51 and P-38 extended deep escort roles, the Thunderbolt's legend was cemented. It ruled the low sky, the place between clouds and chaos, where courage met physics head-on. And as autumn approached, the war it had reshaped would soon face its final reckoning. A reckoning told not in tactics or theories, but in aftermath. The destruction it left behind, the numbers it wrote in steel, and the psychological silence it imposed on a broken Luftwaffe. By the end of 1944, the roar that once filled the skies over Europe had become a rhythm of inevitability. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the continent, was collapsing, its airfields in ruins, its pilots exhausted, its replacement system shattered by constant Allied strikes. For the Allies, the numbers told a story even more powerful than any headline. Between February and December 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt flew over 545,000 combat sorties, dropping more than 132,000 tons of bombs and firing 135 million rounds of ammunition. Nearly 9,000 enemy aircraft were destroyed in the air and on the ground, and tens of thousands of vehicles, tanks, and trains were reduced to wreckage. These were not just statistics. They were the physical proof of a new kind of air power. The Luftwaffe's own post-war studies later confirmed the psychological damage. One surviving staff officer wrote, "Our pilots could no longer climb freely, our tanks could no longer move by day, and our infantry could not assemble without fear of fire from the sky. The Thunderbolt took our mobility, and with it, our war." What had begun as a stopgap escort fighter had become the beating heart of tactical air warfare. The shift was total. No longer was victory in the air defined only by aerial duels. It was now defined by control of the ground below. The Thunderbolt made that control absolute. From the fields of Normandy to the frozen valleys of the Ardennes, the P-47 became the sound of Allied dominance. The Germans named it Der große Vogel, the big bird, a grudging acknowledgement of its power. But the legend was built not just on fear, but on survivability. American mechanics began keeping informal tallies, planes that returned on one engine, or with tails half gone, or wings riddled with holes. Some Thunderbolts limped home with cylinders shot out, oil leaking across canopies, and still managed to land safely. In one documented case, a P-47 returned with 21 holes through the fuselage and both main landing gears destroyed. Yet the pilot survived. The next morning, ground crews painted a small Thunderbolt symbol on the side, as they always did after repairs. The streak of yellow paint meant one thing. She'd been hit, but she was still flying. It was more than a symbol of resilience. It was morale. Crews and pilots alike began to trust their machines almost as comrades. In a war of attrition, that bond mattered. As Allied troops advanced through France and into Belgium, the Thunderbolts became their constant shield. When tanks called for air support, it was the deep, rolling engine note of a P-47 they prayed to hear. When convoys moved through open roads, they scanned the skies for that familiar, bulky silhouette. At Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, in December 1944, the weather finally cleared after weeks of snow and fog. The first aircraft to appear were Thunderbolts, diving from the cloud breaks, unleashing rockets and 500-pound bombs on German artillery. Ground troops cheered. One soldier later recalled, "We'd been trapped, cut off, and then we heard them. It was like hearing God clear his throat." That single moment, the sudden dive through clouds, the burst of gunfire, the smoke rising from enemy armor, captured everything the Thunderbolt had become. A savior by speed, a symbol of endurance, a sound of liberation. Yet even as the Allies pushed into Germany, the Thunderbolt's work was far from over. Bridges across the Rhine, depots near Cologne, rail lines feeding Berlin, all became targets. Each dive carried the same precision, the same terrifying energy that had defined its legend. In every village, farmers and soldiers alike learned to tell the difference between aircraft sounds. The thin whine of the Me-109 meant threat. The deep thunder of the P-47 meant war was ending, And it wasn't ending in Germany's favor. The skies were no longer a battlefield. They had become a verdict. As winter fell over Europe in late 1944, the sky itself seemed quieter. Not because the war was over, but because the Luftwaffe had nearly ceased to exist. The empire of flight that had once darkened Europe's skies was now scattered wreckage across the fields of the Reich. What replaced it was the thunder of Allied dominance. And at the center of that thunder was the P-47. Every statistic from those final months underscored the same truth. Germany's war machine had been dismantled from above. Bridges collapsed faster than they could be rebuilt. Trains burned before reaching the front. Supply lines vanished under trails of smoke that stretched from Normandy to the Rhine. For the first time since 1939, German generals began writing orders that included the phrase air insecurity. It meant that daylight movement was suicidal. Entire divisions were trapped not by encirclement, but by the invisible cage of Allied air power. American commanders understood exactly what this meant. They no longer needed to fight the Luftwaffe plane by plane. The Thunderbolts had already erased the infrastructure that kept it alive. Fuel depots destroyed, runways cratered, repair hangars flattened. The war in the air was not being won. It had already been ended. At ground level, German civilians saw a different face of this domination. Farmers watched P-47s streak overhead, their reflections flashing across rivers and rooftops. Children ran to hide in barns as the engines rumbled like earthquakes. The aircraft had become both a symbol of destruction and of the inevitable, the mechanical sound of defeat drawing nearer each day. Even the Luftwaffe's best, the elite, Jagdgeschwader units that had once ruled Europe's skies, found themselves grounded by fuel starvation. When they did rise, their missions were brief, desperate, and often suicidal. One pilot of JG-26 later said, "By the time we took off, the Thunderbolts were already above us." The operational reports from late 1944 and early 1945 read like obituaries for an air force. Every page listed the same phrases: intercept aborted, formation scattered, fuel exhausted, pilot missing. Meanwhile, Allied airfields were expanding daily. Thunderbolts landed on steel mat runways laid by engineers hours after the front line moved. New squadrons arrived from England, bringing fresh pilots, spare engines, and endless ammunition. For the Germans, there was no recovery. When the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the P-47s were already there, flattening defensive positions, cutting every bridge, sealing every road eastward. By that point, the Luftwaffe was down to fewer than 200 operational fighters in the entire Western Front, most without fuel to fly more than one sortie. And still, the Thunderbolts flew. Their pilots were exhausted but relentless, driven by the belief that each dive, each strike, brought the war closer to its end. Over Cologne, they reduced rail centers to twisted iron. Over Kassel, they erased armored columns retreating toward Berlin. Over the Ruhr, they turned the industrial heart of Germany into a skeletal forest of chimneys and ruins. By April, the war was collapsing faster than intelligence reports could track. One of the last Thunderbolt missions in Europe took place on April 25, 1945. A flight from the 56th Fighter Group strafed a convoy near the Elbe River. Trucks, half-tracks, and what little resistance remained. They returned with no losses. The next day, Soviet troops reached Berlin. In that moment, the circle closed. The aircraft that had first dived out of the clouds over France 2 years earlier had now delivered the final blows over the heart of Germany. When victory was declared in May, pilots stood on quiet runways across France and Belgium, looking at their machines streaked with oil and dust. Some touched the metal as if saying goodbye to a comrade. The Thunderbolt had survived the war, and so had they. The statistics could be counted. The emotion could not. More than 15,600 Thunderbolts built, over 800,000 combat missions, and a legacy measured not just in victories, but in the very sound of the sky. The war in Europe had ended not with a whisper, but with a dive, a roar, and the echo of a machine that had changed history by learning how to fall faster than anything else alive. And that legacy leads to one last question. Not about battles or numbers, but about meaning. What did that thunder really signify in the quiet that followed? When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe exhaled. Cities lay in ruin. The sky cleared of contrails, and for the first time in years, silence replaced thunder. Yet for those who had lived beneath that sky, pilots, soldiers, and civilians alike, the sound of the P-47 remained in memory, as vivid as any photograph. The Thunderbolt had not won the war alone. No single machine ever does, but it changed how wars were fought, and, perhaps more profoundly, how they were survived. It proved that air power was not only about duels between aces or elegant turns above the clouds. It was about endurance, physics, and the courage to harness both. It turned the act of falling, something once feared, into a tactical advantage that reshaped the European battlefield. To dive like a meteor was to embrace chaos and master it. To climb again was to prove that survival could be engineered. For engineers, the Thunderbolt became a case study in limits pushed and lessons learned. Lessons that would lead to the jet age, where every aircraft to follow carried a bit of its DNA. Speed, resilience, adaptability. For historians, it stands as a paradox of war. A weapon built for destruction that ended up saving countless Allied lives by ending fights faster, with fewer losses, and giving control of the skies back to freedom. And for the men who flew it, the legacy was deeply personal. Many spoke of the silence after their final missions, the strange quiet that replaced the engine's thunder, and how, in that quiet, they finally understood what they had done. The P-47 Thunderbolt did not symbolize perfection. It symbolized power with purpose, brutal, decisive, unrelenting. It showed that sometimes victory does not come from grace, but from grit. Not from elegance, but from endurance. It fell from the heavens like a storm, and when it rose again, it carried a continent's hope on its wings. That is why, even now, history remembers the Thunderbolt not just as a machine, but as the sound of liberation. If this story moved you, hit subscribe to keep these forgotten moments of history alive. Tell us in the comments which country or city you're watching from. Every voice adds to this global remembrance. And if you believe the courage of those who flew the Thunderbolt deserves to be remembered, tap the like button. It helps more people hear their story. Because history doesn't fade when we keep it flying.